Hey, look at this, I'm finally covering an RPG that wasn't made by Square. Released in late summer of 1994, EarthBound is actually the sequel to a Japan-exclusive title called Mother, released for the Famicom back in 1989. Thus, EarthBound's original title was Mother 2. The title EarthBound was initially conceived for a US release of the original Mother, but despite that game's localization being nearly finished, it was for whatever reason cancelled, and so the title was just carried over to its sequel instead. The original localization would eventually see official release, though, on the Wii U Virtual Console in 2013, now under the title EarthBound Beginnings. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I completely understand why they changed the title. Mother sounds cool and exotic if you're Japanese, but if you actually know English, it's kind of comical to title a game that. Like, could you imagine if there was a series of video games called Uncle? Hey, I'm gonna go home and play Uncle 2 today. It's just goofy, I'm sorry. So my apologies to the purists out there, I'm just gonna be calling it EarthBound. EarthBound follows the story of a young boy named Ness, who was born with the gift of psychic powers. Awakened one night by the crashing of a meteorite near his home, he is soon sent on a quest to collect 8 melodies from various sanctuaries around the world. In the process, he'll also have to fend off various people, objects, and animals that have been turned into evil creatures by Gigas, an otherworldly invader bent on destroying humanity. Along the way, he'll be joined by fellow psychic child Paula, tech genius Jeff, and a young monk in training named Pooh, and together they learn the truth about their place in the world. The first 2 EarthBound games took a lot of cues from Dragon Quest, using much the same interface and UI, with every action taken on the map being triggered from a pop-up menu, and with battles being full of windowed text in first-person perspectives. Unlike a Dragon Quest game, or even the game it's a sequel to, EarthBound ditches random encounters, and instead battles are triggered by coming into contact with visible enemies wandering the maps. This often allows you to pick and choose which enemies to fight and which to avoid, and battles can be affected by which side of the enemy you approach. For example, if an enemy manages to jump you while your back is turned, you'll be caught in an ambush and they'll be granted a free turn. But that goes both ways, and you can give yourself a free turn by managing to sneak up on them instead. In the brief moment between touching an enemy and the battle screen loading in, other nearby enemies can rush up to join in the fight as well, with sometimes as many as 5 or 6 enemies being on screen at once. The battles themselves are pretty bog-standard JRPG fare for the era. If you've played any of the early Dragon Quest games, you know what to expect here. Battles are entirely turn-based and menu-driven, not much in the way of bells and/or whistles to speak of. There's an auto-battle function that has each character perform what the game feels is the most appropriate action at any given point, usually just a standard attack or a heal spell. Probably the most clever mechanic introduced here is the concept of the rolling HP meter. Whenever your characters take damage, their HP values roll back gradually like numbers on a rolling odometer. And so in any instance where one of your characters has technically taken mortal damage, you can prevent a KO by managing to heal the character or end the battle before their meter actually reaches 0. It's a really simple but clever way to add some tension and excitement to a genre that's typically very mechanical by nature. Where EarthBound games differ most from their Dragon Quest inspirations, though, is in their setting. Rather than the traditional medieval fantasy environment of most RPGs, EarthBound goes for a feeling of then-contemporary 90s Americana, and this was pretty unique in a time before games like Persona and Pokémon popularized contemporary backdrops in RPGs. In place of swords, axes, and bows, there are baseball bats, frying pans, and slingshots. Rather than cathedrals, shops, and gold coins, you have hospitals, drugstores, and dollar bills. You save your game by calling your dad, and money you earn in battle has to be withdrawn from an ATM before you can spend it. It's all a really clever use of the setting. Standing in for the magic spells of your typical fantasy RPG are instead psychic powers, which, when you think about it, are the modern-day equivalent of magic, wouldn't you say? The game also lacks a traditional world map, with each town or location seamlessly transitioning into the next. With the game's focus on its setting and all the inhabitants of its silly little world, it was important that every location feel like a big part of a whole, rather than just a dot on a map. And I'd say they succeeded here. The game world feels large but never barren, homey but never cramped. The fast travel system is also pretty interesting. You eventually gain access to 2 different variations of the teleport psychic ability, one of which requires you to run in a straight line and the other running in circles. Either one only succeeding if you manage to not collide with anything before the process is over. It can't be used indoors or in dungeons either, so you actually have to think about your current positioning whenever you need to warp somewhere. I just thought it added another layer to the whole thing. It was neat. In many ways, EarthBound acts as a sort of parody of the RPG genre, and this subversion of the typical RPG setting is the biggest way in which it does so. It humorously lampoons a lot of RPG story tropes along the way, such as when you meet the mighty hero from the future, a beetle named Buzz, who tells Ness of the journey he must take on in order to save the world. Buzz then joins you as a guest party member, and he deals massive amounts of damage compared to Ness, easily reaching triple digits. And then almost as soon as you defeat the game's first boss together, Buzz accidentally frightens a neighbor lady, is swatted out of the air, and then he fucking dies. That's hilarious. A lot of EarthBound's humor falls along those lines, and that's why it works so well in terms of tone, I think. It avoids the sort of obnoxious cynicism you see in a lot of modern YouTube parodies and such, where they act like they're somehow above the source material and are actively making fun of it. No, in this case you can tell the creators of EarthBound really loved the genre and were using their knowledge of its typical quirks and habits to make for some genuinely good gags. Visually, EarthBound is unfortunately not very impressive. By far my most played RPG franchise is Final Fantasy, and I often forget that those games are considered high-budget, cream-of-the-crop examples of the genre. The graphics, user interface, and snappy battle speeds of those games have really spoiled me, and I only really realized this upon playing EarthBound for the first time. The visuals in EarthBound are charming, if a bit primitive even for their time. At first glance, I could barely tell the difference between a screenshot from this game and EarthBound Beginnings, which is something you shouldn't be saying about games that are a console generation apart. This is a late-stage Super Nintendo game, and it barely looks better than games that came out in the console's first year. Granted, that could be due to the fact that EarthBound spent 5 whole years in development. Nowadays, that may not sound that bad, but back then this was an abnormally lengthy amount of time between games, especially considering there was no gap in dev time here. Work on Mother 2 started almost as soon as the first game was out. I guess the game being split between 2 studios in separate cities that required frequent traveling and exchanging of documents had quite the toll on development. When it became clear the team was having troubles, and were even threatened with cancellation at some point, then president of HAL Labs, Satoru Iwata, stepped in to offer his programming expertise. And upon looking at what the team had made so far, he told them that it would be faster for them to just start from scratch with his help than for him to try to fix what was already there. With all that in mind, I guess the somewhat outdated visuals are forgivable. After all, this game was meant to come out years earlier than it actually did. EarthBound's UI is also a bit archaic, sticking true to the Dragon Quest style of menus where, say, instead of going up to an NPC and just pressing A to talk to them, you instead go up to an NPC and press A to open a menu, where you then choose the Talk To option. Granted, the most recent mainline Dragon Quest game, Dragon Quest V, was still doing this too, but most other RPGs would consider this to be a clunky practice by as early as the following year. And Final Fantasy games have never used that kind of system. If you ask me, you should be trying to streamline menu interface as much as possible, even in RPGs. The button layout for EarthBound was designed so that you could play entirely with your left hand if you want, and I guess that's kinda neat. Battles are lifted almost wholesale from Dragon Quest, at least visually, with first-person windowed views of the enemies you're fighting. But whereas Dragon Quest had actual location backgrounds visible on the battlefield, EarthBound instead goes for more abstract psychedelic visuals that are constantly moving and swirling. And I honestly don't know if I like this or not. The effects are pretty impressive technically speaking, but I think having actual backdrops on each battlefield would help ground them and make certain set-piece battles stand out more. As it is now, every battle just kinda blends into the next one. Also, it seems ridiculous to me that a game released in 1994 still requires you to buy and sell items one at a time. Cashiers will at least offer to buy back old weapons and armor if you buy and equip new ones in front of them, but that's really the biggest convenience the game offers in terms of streamlining this process. Final Fantasy had you buying items in bulk as far back as the 3rd game in 1990. It seems ridiculous for an RPG to still be handling item purchases this way 4 years later. One thing EarthBound absolutely gets right, though, is its difficulty curve, and this was apparently done in response to criticisms of the first game's overly grindy nature. Experience and money rewards are more than generous, and I never once felt the need to grind for levels or cash. By the end of the game, without even trying, I was maxed out on cash, and my party members were all around level 70 or so. And once the gap between your stats and the enemy's stats become vast enough, battles will automatically resolve themselves before the screen even loads in, saving you a lot of time in the late game by sparing you the need to fight enemies that will just die in one turn anyway. Dungeons are long enough and enemies formidable enough to make conserving HP and PP a real challenge, but there are also these little butterflies placed at fairly generous intervals, which restore 20 psychic points for your whole party and can be spawn scummed for repeated use if you so choose. Item storage is limited in this game, with each of the 4 party members being able to hold 14 items. This includes key items and equipment, and duplicate items don't stack either. Some may find this annoying, but I largely didn't have a problem with it here. It was still very common practice for RPGs of the era, and the game offers several methods through which to free yourself of excess items. First of all, the game always seemed to grant me my next party member right as the previous one was running out of space, but it goes even beyond just having good pacing. Fairly early on, you can buy the For Sale sign key item, which will summon an NPC to your current location to buy a single item off of you, for those instances where you're full up but too deep into a dungeon to double back to the nearest store. And whenever you have access to a phone, you can call in a delivery service to store things for you, such as key items that have outlived their usefulness. There were really only 2 things that annoyed me about this system. Firstly is the party member Jeff. Unlike the other 3 party members, Jeff cannot use any psychic abilities, and so all of his most powerful battle options rely on either consumable items or infinite use tools that he has to lug around. There are also various broken items you can find, which Jeff may randomly repair into new tools or equipment once his IQ stat passes certain thresholds. This is a cool idea in theory, but in practice you typically have to force the process by resting over and over until he actually repairs these items, and so this broken equipment spends a lot of time just wasting space in your pack. Add his equipment on top of that, and by endgame you have a character who's basically useless in terms of item management. Secondly, there is one segment late in the game where your party is briefly cut down to just one character again without warning, and that really hurt in this regard. The game does still offer its delivery service during that segment, but unless you have the foresight to know exactly how much to store ahead of time, you'll either be making multiple trips or just cutting your losses and leaving items behind. There are also a few cases where it feels like the game just had too many ideas for its own good. Like, why is the bicycle rental shop even in the game? As soon as you get a second party member, the bike is useless, so why even bother having it in the game for the brief period you can actually use it? Seriously, I didn't even bother to get any footage of it. It's completely pointless. And let's also talk about the homesick status condition. Most of the status conditions in EarthBound are your typical RPG fare: poison, paralysis, confusion, so on and so forth. Homesickness is a status condition that's unique to Ness. It distracts him and may randomly cause him to waste turns in battle thinking about home. The first time I was afflicted with this status, I remembered the phones you use to call your dad and the item delivery services can also be used to call your mom, and I thought to myself, oh, that's why you can call your mom, to prevent you from getting homesick. That's really clever. But then I got homesick again later on, right after I had made sure to call my mom. So I looked into it, and it turns out calling your mom has nothing to do with preventing homesickness. The condition just has a small, random chance of happening for absolutely no reason after any battle. Calling your mom is simply how you cure it. And just like that, my opinion changed from that's really clever to, oh, that's pretty dumb, actually. It's a charming idea in theory that has a really weird execution, and I'd rather it just not be in the game at all. I was also pretty mixed on the game's soundtrack. Tying in with the suburban Americana vibe, the music goes for a lot of jazzy and folksy sounds. And while I thought all the travel and town themes were great, and the game's main and ending themes are fantastic, I thought the battle themes were very odd. Here, just listen. I don't know, maybe they're an acquired taste, but they are just not my thing. Critical reception to EarthBound at the time, particularly in the States, was lukewarm, to say the least. Its graphics were seen as overly simplistic and cartoonish, especially in the wake of games like Secret of Mana and Final Fantasy VI. Its story and gameplay were both seen as fairly bare bones and unimpressive, and while its tone and sense of humor were a source of much praise, a handful of critics wondered who the game was for. It seemed too crass for kids, but too childish for teens or adults. The game would also completely flop in the West, barely managing to sell even half the number of copies it did in Japan. Much of the blame for this likely comes down to two factors. The first being the downright bizarre US marketing the game got, which consisted of gross, scratch-and-sniff print ads that claimed, "This game stinks," telling readers nothing about what the game actually was. Reportedly, the most common complaint GamePro magazine received in 1995 was about those scratch-and-sniff ads. The second factor was the game's price. The US version came with the official strategy guide included, which, on the one hand, was a decent idea. RPGs were still pretty unpopular and abstract for most Americans, and so providing them with a walkthrough right there in the box could prevent a lot of kids from getting confused. But on the other hand, it also inflated the game's price tag by a good $20 or so, and most of the American team who worked on the game cite this as the most likely culprit of the game's poor sales, considering this game was released at the tail end of the console's lifespan when public interest in new titles would have already been waning. This combination of mixed review scores and poor sales meant EarthBound remained an obscure title for a very long time, and arguably still is. In both Japan and the US, EarthBound wouldn't get a single official re-release for 19 years. The 2013 Wii U re-release was the first one, and it was also the first time Europe had gotten the game at all. This relative obscurity, no doubt combined with NES being a mainstay playable fighter in the Super Smash Bros. Games, is likely one of the major factors in fueling the game's current status as a cult classic. EarthBound has also sort of become the de facto representation for video game preservation, as this was a major Nintendo-backed title that, for all intents and purposes, was basically lost to time for nearly 2 decades. And that sucks. But despite complaints from both critics and myself, the thing about EarthBound, or at least the feeling I got playing it for the first time, is that trying to break it down and critique it by its individual pieces is kinda missing the point. EarthBound is a lot more than just the sum of its parts. This was my first time playing the game, and I'll be honest, for much of the playthrough, I found myself thinking, yeah, this is fun and silly and all, but like, where's this going? The game gives clear objectives the whole way, but it never really feels like any of it is tying together in a meaningful way. And being the game I played immediately after Final Fantasy VI, that's disappointing. FF6 is such a hard act to follow in terms of story. Also, there's this annoying photographer guy who keeps showing up and taking pictures with this unskippable cutscene every time. Like, what's the point of that? There's no way for me to view these photos. What is he doing? 15 hours in, I was just ready for this game to be over. I wasn't having a horrible time or anything, but nothing about the gameplay itself really jumped out at me, and the story was failing to keep me interested either. But then, as I collected the 8th and final melody and prepared to enter the game's final stretch, this happens. And this scene was the moment I stopped and thought to myself, okay, I trust what you guys are doing here. EarthBound may not be the greatest RPG in my eyes, but it's definitely one of the most unique. My mistake was expecting EarthBound's story to be some grand, dramatic epic. Those are the types of RPGs I'm used to, and so it's what I expected here, after seeing the passionate cult fanbase the game has earned after all these years. But that's not what EarthBound's story is. That's not what it's trying to be. EarthBound is the story of 4 kids working together to save their homes and their families, and by the end, even risking their own bodies for the sake of protecting everything they love. And after defeating a strikingly abstract and unforgivingly Lovecraftian final boss, the game gives the player one last chance to take in the world as you escort your party members home, and then finally return to your own. As the end credits roll, all the pictures taken by that annoying photographer finally scroll by, delivering payoff to all those times he interrupted you, and reminding you of all you've been through. EarthBound is a game about forging memories that are meaningful to you. It's a wonderful celebration of its genre and of all the small beauties of a modern everyday life. No overblown theatrics or melodrama, only the simple pleasures you derive from just doing your part to make the world a better place. One melody at a time.